Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast. Our featured speaker is Sam Hanson. Sam is an Associate Principal Vulnerability Analyst at Dragos, specializing in vulnerabilities and malware affecting operational technology and industrial control systems. His expertise includes discovering zero-day vulnerabilities in industrial software, analyzing malware samples, and hunting for novel ICS-related capabilities in malware repositories. Sam has worked on high-profile ICS-related malware cases, including Pipedream and FuxNet. If during the webcast you have any questions for Sam, feel free to enter them into the Q&A window at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording will be available for viewing in the next 48 hours, all of which can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Sam.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you, Jennifer, for the introduction. And thanks for everyone for registering and hopping on today. And also last thanks is a special thanks to SANS ICS for hosting. Welcome to the webcast, the story of Kurtlar SCADA from malware discovery to victim notification. My name is Sam Hanson. I'm an Associate Principal Vulnerability Analyst at Dragos, which means I get to dabble in vulnerability analysis, vulnerability research, malware analysis, and threat hunting, but all specifically focused on identifying cyber threats and cyber risks to industrial systems. So if you work in or near industrial cybersecurity, then you've probably seen or heard of hacktivism in the news. In 2024, we've seen a lot of hacktivist events that have caught major media attention. You may have heard of the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, who compromised internet exposed and poorly secured devices over VNC in different sectors, but including water and wastewater, oil and natural gas throughout a few different states. This appears to be regional but opportunistic targeting based on geopolitical events. So from past cases, it appears they're less likely to go after specific organizations, but more likely to scan for exposed assets in maybe a targeted region. It's worth noting that they have achieved stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain by modifying HMI values. And here that GIF on the screen is actually a video of them clicking around a compromised HMI, kind of seemingly like aimlessly and without a full understanding of what buttons do what. And I think the US Department of the Treasury described it the best in the indictment of these actors when they said, despite the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn briefly gaining control of these industrial control systems, instances of major damage to victims have thus far been avoided due to the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn's lack of technical sophistication. Or perhaps you've heard of the hunter killers who claimed compromise of exposed Siemens and Unitronics PLCs, another case of an opportunistic hacktivist group that's leveraging default credentials and to gain access to devices and leveraging Telegram to advertise their activity. Again, they did reach stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain by modifying device fields and resetting credentials. Or perhaps you've heard of the Cyber Avengers, who compromised Israeli-made Unitronics PLCs and HMIs over multiple countries. So the tweet that you're seeing on the right is a real tweet from the Full Pint Beer Brewery in Pittsburgh. Recent developments such as the IO control malware, which has been publicly attributed to the Cyber Avengers, demonstrate an increased capability that strays away from, well, the trend a bit of hacktivists. So it'll be interesting to see how this group continues to evolve over the next year or so. But this is a pro-Iranian hacktivist persona that CISA affiliates with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. So the list goes on and on. There's many actors that have smaller Telegram channels that don't get the media attention that the last 3 that I mentioned have. But it seems like one of the trends from these hacktivist groups is that they care a lot more about the attention that they receive than the actual impact of the attack. That's a bit of a bold statement. It probably is not true for every single case, but often they're seemingly in it more for the attention. So considering all of these patterns, what does hacktivism look like? Well, typically they're geopolitically motivated. They announce their activities on encrypted messaging services like Telegram, and they will often share some TTPs They'll target internet exposed devices. They'll use default credentials to actually gain access into those exposed devices. And they'll use open source tools to, well, for exploitation purposes or whatever it might be. But they remain primarily opportunistic. Once they say they gain access to a compromised HMI or whatever else industrial device, do they actually know what they're doing to cause an impact if they wanted to? That is a bit debatable. So in this presentation, we're going to introduce another hacktivist persona. Now, this group is certainly not as capable, nor the impact as dramatic as some of the events that have taken place in this past year. But I believe this overall experience, this research is valuable to share with the community. So we're going to go through the discovery, the analysis, and then the resulting victim notifications that stemmed from this project. And hopefully along the way, we will learn a little bit about malware analysis and some threat hunting. So yeah, I'd like you to keep in mind the patterns that I mentioned on the previous slide, seen by hacktivist groups, because it kind of demonstrates and reinforces each point of this presentation. So a bit of background before jumping in. One of my primary functions at Dragos is to threat hunt and malware repositories such as VirusTotal. So most people watching this webcast is probably familiar with VirusTotal, but I want to make sure that everyone who hears this story understands what's happening. So a bit of brief background. VirusTotal is a massive repository of files where anyone could go and submit a file that they suspect to be malicious. VirusTotal will scan it with a variety of different antivirus engines. So it functions basically as a free comprehensive antivirus engine scan, and it'll spit back the results to the user. From a VT enterprise user perspective, or from a VirusTotal customer perspective, we get to hunt through all of that massive data set of submitted files to hunt for malicious activity. There's a lot of ways to quote unquote hunt for this malicious activity, but here we can see an example query that identifies an executable file submitted from Iran with SCADA in the name. Now, this is a very simple example. I often, think I zoomed in somehow. I don't know how I did that. Okay, there we go. We fixed it. So I think as an analyst, we tend to assume that the more technically complex a query is, the more accurate or useful it might be. I would challenge that viewpoint. In my experience, the simplest queries tend to go the furthest. And also, trying dozens of query combinations is very valuable, especially when you're hunting for novel or emerging threats where you don't have a specific IOC to pivot off of. It can be a bit of a game of numbers. So trying a lot of different queries, maybe off by one search term, right? Just trying little mutations is very useful. There also exists more advanced features like leveraging the Yara, which is a rule-based language to identify specific files or specific strings of files or specific attributes in files or code bytes. So the example on the right that you see is a screenshot of a very simple Yara rule. It looks for the overlap of ICS-related compiled Python files, right? So it's looking for, do they have strings that are related to ICS or OT vendors, protocols, devices, and is it a compiled Python binary? So that's just a very specific example. More generally, we are doing something like the Venn diagram, which is trying to find the overlap of malicious files or maybe document files that could be phishes or something like that contain ICS-related keywords or vendors, et cetera. So Yara is just a very useful tool in finding this overlap. And you can leverage Yara to run retro hunts. So retro hunts is a mechanism in VirusTotal that allows you to search for files that have been submitted from this past year. So you can write Yara rules, and then that will be scanned over the files submitted from the past 365 days. This is analogous to a bit of a funny analogy, but it's analogous to taking a big net, right, and doing some deep sea fishing where you're taking a net and you're dragging it along the ocean floor, collecting a bunch of different fish. Maybe you've created a net that you hope to catch a very specific fish, but you're going to catch some false positives as well. So then you have to kind of sort through those fish to figure out you have to triage them to identify the fish that you want. And then there's another feature called live hunts, which enables continuous monitoring, a little bit more future forward thinking, where any file that gets submitted onto VirusTotal in the future will be ran from the YARA rule that you provide it. So just two different ways of hunting. The live hunting is a bit more analogous to like casting a lure out and just waiting for the fish to bite. So one day I figured it would be wise to search for OT or ICS related files submitted from geopolitical hotbed zones. Specifically, it seems like malicious activity tends to follow geopolitical activity often. That's why we're looking at it from geopolitical hotbed zones or files submitted from them. The screenshot on the top is a very simple query looking for Python files with SCADA in the name that were submitted from Iran, which resulted in only one file appearing. So once you have a suspicious file, you need to triage it. And that is very dependent on the file type. So in this case, it's Python. The quickest way to triage a Python file, I would argue, is just to open it up and look at what the file contents actually contain. So a quick glance over the code does confirm that it looks suspicious. The script uses marshaled code objects to load and execute an additional Python script. This is a non-standard behavior for a benign Python script, for a legitimate Python script, so it's likely a mechanism to obfuscate their code and prevent detections from capabilities like YARA. This type of obfuscation is typical in JavaScript, if anyone has familiar with that. I've seen a very, very similar obfuscation layer. But the fact that it utilized this obfuscation technique combined with SCADA being in the name, plus the fact that it was submitted from a region that had some geopolitical activity this past year, confirmed that it was a file that deserved further analysis. So now that we're very suspicious of this particular file, we can't just quickly rule it out as a false positive and move along. I wanted to check to see if there were any additional binaries or scripts in VirusTotal that could be released, or that could be related, rather. So by searching for files submitted from Iran with kurtlar in the name, kind of pivoting off that original file name, we quickly discovered an additional binary, one that was just named kurtlar.exe. So the ASCII art you see on the right is from this binary. It was embedded inside this binary, which honestly, as a defender, I found to be a good sign. I say this half jokingly, but when malware embeds cool ASCII art, I've often found that means the capability is less technically impressive, to be honest. This is especially true with Activist. Certainly a bit of a sweeping statement, but in this case, it relaxed me just a touch. But further pivoting off of that username, which was embedded in the ASCII art, led to the discovery of a Telegram channel. Well, actually, one of my coworkers discovered this Telegram channel, and it was very clearly related to this malware and activity. So one of the takeaways from this presentation that I'd like folks to walk away with is that simple queries, whether it be in VirusTotal, as you saw before, or whether it's Google in the screenshots or whatever data set you're working with, often they get you pretty far. And that it's more about trying every single combination, pivoting off of every single thing you can, every username, every unique looking string, that I found most useful over prioritizing very complex techniques. Anyways, getting back to the story, at this point, we don't know exactly what the binary is or what it might do. We're just collecting information, right? So we found this Telegram channel. It's another data point that we can just kind of read very easily to analyze and figure out what's going on. So to talk about the specifics, what's called the kurtlar Cyber Lab Telegram channel boasts over 4,500 different members. The administrator operates several backup channels on Telegram. This is because of the recent events due to the Telegram owner's arrest. I think Pavel Durov was his name, or is his name, and their agreement to start sharing information with law enforcement and cracking down on some of the illegal activity that's on Telegram. So if you're a researcher and you want to go check out these channels, just know that there are multiple and they all link to each other, so you should be able to find them. But they are kind of broken out into topics and stuff. So they make their ideology very clear. They are very pro-Iran. In fact, they sell a variety of tools. We're going to talk about that here in just a second, but they offer discounts to those tools for anyone who's targeting the US or targeting Israel. You could see on the screenshot on the right, they their followers to not hack Iranian sites. So yeah, they claim to be an anti-terrorism channel, but not exactly how I'd describe them. They're actively promoting hacking Western critical infrastructure, government websites, defacing really anyone they can. So not exactly how I would describe them, but get a peek into their ideology. They have additional advertisements. So this is one of them for the tool that we're taking a look at now, the Kurtlar SCADA tool. They posted this in the Telegram channel, advertising it as a SCADA-specific tool that can hack gas and water sources. Of course, as an OT threat hunter, this is immediately interesting to me. But hacktivists often lie. And in this case, I was looking for additional proof, which they provided somewhat. So the administrator posted several pictures of allegedly compromised HMIs to this Telegram channel. From their posts, it appears that they're more interested in financial gain and notoriety than actually achieving an impact. And I say this because while they do deface some HMIs by adding a picture of Elliot from Mr. Robot to the HMI screen, and I wish I was joking, but that is actually true. You can barely see it. I know it's small, but the screenshot on the right, there's an HMI screen there, and there's a picture of Elliot from Mr. Robot holding his arms up in the air. But they deface HMIs. They don't actually attempt to modify values or click buttons or mess with the operational process, at least from what I've seen. They just tend to gain access to it, maybe modify it slightly to change a picture or whatever, add a screenshot. But they gain access primarily to brag about it and show that their tool that they're advertising does work. So a variety of HMIs that are showing a variety of different operational processes were posted. This seems to confirm the theory that it's an opportunistic attacker, right? Like they're not going after a specific organization, but rather compromising seemingly anything they can. And there are primarily 4 tools that they sell. They have additional things they sell like exploits, web shells, database dumps, distributed denial of service tools, and then initial access into some organizations and supposedly governments. And then they also offer a VIP channel containing private hacking courses, which we'll come back to. But some of the additional tools that they do offer is SpyLens, which is a camera hacking tool, an IP camera hacking tool. Then there's SMS Bomber, which seems to be a tool that sends mass text messages out. I'm guessing for scamming purposes, but I don't know that. They have the Shodan Grabber, which I highlighted because I'm most curious about this tool. Its claims is to bypass the monthly Shodan query credit limit. I don't know if this is true, but they have a video of it seemingly working. There's a screenshot right there from it where they're checking to see if any assets that have a screenshot in Israel. And then they have another tool called Shell Finder, which exploits vulnerable web servers and uploads web shells. So a variety of different tools. Likely they're not super technically impressive, but providing some basic access capabilities to their followers. And they're being sold for roughly like $100 to $120 USD. So briefly, a timeline before we dive into the actual analysis. So the tool was advertised on Telegram on August 14th from this past year. The first part of the tool, there's 2 parts that work together. So the first part of the tool was uploaded the 29th. So just about 2 weeks after they started advertising it on Telegram. Then about 10-ish days or so after that, they uploaded Kurtlar SCADA, which is the second component to the tool. And about a month after that was when we discovered them in VirusTotal. So it all happened pretty quick. From when the authors announced the tool to when we discovered them on VirusTotal was about 2 months. At this point, we need to start diving deeper into the analysis of the 2 samples. We know that the tool is being advertised as a SCADA HMI remote access tool, but we really don't know if it's legitimate, right? Like we don't know if we certainly can't trust their claims outright. But if it is trustworthy, then how does it work? And can we identify the victims from the HMI screenshots? So to start the analysis, zooming in on kurtlar.exe, which is one of the components of the tool. We'll talk about how they all work together here in a bit, but virus total indicated that this specific binary was a PyInstaller generated compiled Python binary. This is actually great news for us because you can usually obtain the original Python source code by decompiling these types of binaries. And so we can see after downloading it and running a few commands, like running strings and then grepping for Python, we can see what version of Python it's expecting to be ran with. And there you can see it's Python version 3.12, which will be very relevant here in a couple slides. A brief tangent on compiled Python is required before we resume the analysis. So for those who are unfamiliar, compiled Python is a mechanism that bundles the Python interpreter with Python bytecode into a single standalone executable. The bytecode is an intermediate representation of the Python source code, which Python just compiles into before execution by the Python virtual machine. These are all internal compiled Python stuff. We don't need to know it in great detail, but just to provide some simple background. But compiled Python is desirable for threat actors since they don't need to worry about dependency issues on the host system that's executing the binary. Or anyone with enough experience writing Python probably understands how painful and finicky Python versions and Python dependencies can be. Right, the difference between Python 3.7 versus 3.5 can be quite a lot, and can stop your code from working if you mix up the wrong version. So this mitigates that issue by just bundling the Python interpreter with the bytecode together. Further, Python has tons of open source library support. So there are dozens and dozens of industrial protocol implementations available on GitHub that you can just go and import into your code, and bam, you have a OPC-UA library or a Modbus library or whatever it might be. So it just makes writing operational technology related tools a lot easier. All right, so a bit of nuance to discuss here. So compiled Python has a bit of history in the context of ICS threats. First, there was first Iron Gate, which was discovered in 2016. A masquerading PDF, which was a Modbus client in 2017, Cosmic Energy in 2023. All of those appear to be more red teaming and researcher pet projects tools rather than malware designed to be deployed against a real world target. But all those used compiled Python in some way. Sandworms, Telebots, and Camosite's brute forcing and password spraying tool aren't technically ICS malware. Rather, they're tools used by threat groups that have expressed interest in the OT environment, and in some cases impacted them. Then there's Trisis and Pipedream, which certainly are the most serious threats, and are certainly classified as ICS malware. I'm not going to talk too much about those as it's a bit out of scope for this presentation, and it's been covered in previous webinars. But the point here is that, or it's not that all of these threats are real malware meant to disrupt operational environments. Rather, the point is to demonstrate that there's a history of experimenting with compiled Python, whether it's threat actors or whether it's researchers. And that's likely due to the advantages mentioned in the previous slide, that you avoid version and dependency problems, and really primarily that Python has a lot of operational technology support, OT protocols, ICS protocols, right? There's probably an implementation for near every protocol out there. Not to mention Python's just easy to program in. So, okay, we've determined that this is what we have is a compiled Python binary. So because it's a compiled Python binary, we can decompile it to obtain the original Python source code, which is amazing. So what does that typical process look like? Well, you use a few tools in Tangent here. So step one is to run the Py instruction extractor tool. which will create a PYC file, which contains the Python bytecode from the binary. So you run py_instruction extractor against that curtlar.exe. That will print out a curtlar_scada.pyc file. Once you have a PYC file, you can run what's called pycdc is the tool. Both of these tools are available on GitHub, by the way. These are open source tools. Anyone can use them. So once you have a PYC file, you can run pycdc, which will actually turn the bytecode back into the original source code. And assuming everything works correctly, we can obtain, we got the original source code in just a few minutes of analysis work. So very easy. It's worth noting that it's not always this simple. For one, additional tools exist outside of PyInstaller to compile Python binaries, like py_to_exe. But the process is very similar for decompiling those binaries. The only time it really sucks is when it's something like transpiled Python to C code, like it's a NuITCA binary, for example. If anyone's had, if anyone's familiar with that tool. But that's a bit separate from the compiled Python discussion we're having today. And luckily, we're not dealing with the NuITCA compiled binary. Unfortunately, in our case, curtlar_scada does not decompile. So we were able to successfully extract the bytecode from the binary, but when attempting to decompile the bytecode into the source code, it fails. And this is because pycdc does not support Python version 3.12. In fact, it doesn't support any Python version that's greater or equal to 3.10, I believe. So thankfully, in just this past year, new tools based on AI can help us. So I wanted to specifically call out the awesome work of researchers at the University of Texas at Dallas for their work with Pylingual. So Pylingual is a transformer-based model that helps decompile Python source code from Python bytecode. It's far from perfect, but it's very useful for not too complex of bytecode. And in many cases, it's really our only option if it's, again, Python version 3.10 or later. So with Pylingual, you can just drag and drop a PYC file right directly onto the interface. This will upload the file, and they will run whatever transformer model they have to obtain the original source code and then present it to the user. It's very simple to use. You can use static analysis of the bytecode disassembly. That does work, but that is going to be a bit of a lift. So again, they're not necessarily needed since the bytecode is an intermediate representation of the Python source code. Static analysis is possible of the Python bytecode. In fact, the disassembly is in a lot of ways similar to x86. That's a very big statement, but in some ways they are, right? I'm not going to go into technical details of how the Python virtual machine works under the hood, but it is similar to x86 in the sense that it's a stack-based interpreter. So like on the right is some very simple instructions. The store fast is equivalent to the pop instruction for x86. So just simple things like that can be kind of knowledge transferred. But while static analysis and reading the bytecode disassembly can be doable, unfortunately, the main curtlar_scada payload is heavily obfuscated. So it's going to increase the analysis time quite a bit. So we need to find faster mechanisms. There are also 3 obfuscation layers used by the main curtlar_scada script. The ones in green are not problematic. We already talked about the marshalling Python bytecode one, and we're going to talk about defeating that in just a second. But the one in red is a problem, and that's symbol obfuscation. What that does is it renames variables and functions that would normally be found in the disassembly into nonsense, right? So those locals and those names that are highlighted there on that screenshot, those normally would be variable names given by the author that are, contextually relevant, which help us read the code base. But unfortunately, an obfuscation tool was likely ran over the Python source code, which changed the names into nonsense, and therefore slows down and hinders our analysis, although it does not completely block it, certainly. So I'm going to go over defeating the marshaled bytecode, as well as defeating the hex encoding of strings. Both of these are very easy, but I just wanted to cover it just for background. So the screenshot you see here is an example of the marshaled Python bytecode. So on line 2, we import the Marshall library. Then a marshaled bytecode object is declared on line 4. That it actually contains our innermost Python script. We'll talk about that in just a second. Line 5 deserializes the bytecode into a Python code object, which can be executed. And then line 6, of course, executes that Python object. So the scripts that we're looking at can be, of course, it's an example script, but it is basically equivalent in functionality. And it can be thought of as a wrapper script, which embeds the real payload in that byte string. So yeah, the actual code that is going to be executed is represented by that byte string. It can almost be thought of as like a malware loader. So defeating this is actually pretty simple. We can edit the script in a few ways to obtain a valid PYC file, which can then, at least ideally, be decompiled into source code. So looking at that bottom screenshot now and looking at the additions to the code that we made, first we added an import library, one called importlib. Then, and this is extremely crucial, we comment out line 7. So the payload doesn't actually execute. Please do not execute malware on the machine on accident. Then we declare a new bytecode variable on line 8 and create a valid representation of the PYC file by using that imported library, importlib. We called one of its internal functions, it's _code to timestamp PYC. And that will basically format the bytecode in a way that is a valid PYC file representation. And then from there, we can just print it out to a file, and we have the innermost Python bytecode now. We've defeated the marshaled layer. The other easily defeated obfuscation technique is the hex encoding of strings. This is very easy, so I'm going to spend a very little time on it, but they were found embedded in a function that would terminate execution if process names matched, well, the encoded strings that you see on the right there. This technique is primarily useful for avoiding detections and will not hamper us too much. A simple CyberChef recipe can get this sorted and get this decoded very quickly. CyberChef, if you're unfamiliar, is an awesome tool provided by the GCHQ. I created a simple recipe to remove single quotes and extra spaces, and then added a hex encoded new line character at the very end. So padded it with a hex encoded new line character, and then just decoded it from hex, and you can see all of the encoded strings. So if you actually look at the strings, these are common malware analysis tool names that can be found on a malware analysis host system. So while the hex encoding is to obfuscate and hide from YAR rules and other detections, the purpose of the strings were to ensure that we aren't in an analysis environment and executing. So basically, the anti-analysis checks will stop dynamic execution from sandbox solutions. Therefore, potentially tricking analysts into thinking that this binary is boring and doesn't really do much, but in reality, it just stopped execution because it noticed it was being analyzed. So I'm not going to go over the static analysis of an obfuscated bytecode disassembly, as that would probably knock everyone out. Even just saying that sentence nearly put me to sleep. But the winning answer to understanding how Kurtlar's SCADA works under the hood was a mix of using AI models like Bilingual and ChatGPT even. But more importantly was the static analysis. Even though it was obfuscated, you can still read that Python bytecode disassembly and slowly start to figure out things as they, kind of piece together. And then using those bilingual, maybe in smaller sections, to obtain some of what it thinks the original source code is or what it might do. And as it turns out, the code is fairly simple. It functions primarily as a simple VNC client with some basic brute forcing capabilities. So I'm going to now walk through the execution flow to kind of understand how it works in detail. So curtlar.exe is the first binary that's executed. it expects a file to be provided as a command line argument. And that file is called, in this case, ips.txt. Really, it's just a file containing IP addresses, one per line, and that is ingested into kurtler.exe. If you don't know how to find exposed industrial devices on the internet, don't worry. This threat group, which we track as TET2476 as a temporary activity thread, they provide a class where you can learn how to find, using Shodan, how to find exposed and poorly secured industrial devices. So you generate that file containing IP addresses, one IP address per line. Then kurtler_SCADA.exe, that gets executed. That will iterate over each IP address and perform the following flow logic. So it will attempt VNC connection without any authentication. If the connection is successful, it will take a screenshot, basically to prove that it gained access to the HMI or to whatever VNC server is running. If authentication is required, then it will attempt to perform, or it will perform brute forcing with a small list of hard-coded credentials. So there's a list of hard-coded credentials that are actually embedded in the binary, and it just attempts authentication with those. If the connection is successful, it takes a screenshot. If every single one has failed, then it will exit. Everything said, this malware execution flow is pretty simple. It doesn't do anything that's too crazy fancy. I would say the most impressive part might be the ASCII art. I say that half jokingly, but that isn't to say that it can't do damage. So now that we have a bit more detailed understanding of how the code works under the hood, and we can see how simple it is, let's reassess the Telegram channel advertisements to see if they're, well, accurate. So in one of their posts on Telegram, they claim this kurtlar tool can hack gas and water sources. And that's kind of false, at least the way that they worded it. It's advertised as a SCADA-specific tool, but in reality, really what it's targeting is a remote access protocol, right? It's targeting VNC, and it's looking for VNC or poorly secured devices that speak VNC, sure, and that can be industrial devices, but it's not specifically focused on industrial devices, and nor would I call this a SCADA tool. Yeah, really the SCADA specific functionality here is the generation of those IP addresses in the files, right? Because those are presumed to be HMIs. If you created a list of IP addresses and those IPs were, medical devices that ran, okay, well, hopefully not medical devices, but some other random IP camera or something that ran VNC, then would they call this an IP camera hacking tool, right? Like, really, it's targeting a more core technology, which is VNC. So as with kind of usual, hacktivists are over-promising and under-delivering. So let's now check this other Telegram message, which is, we provide our own support, and no one is going to have a problem running this tool. Well, that's true. They do provide a support channel. If you do purchase this tool, you gain access into the VIP channel, where you can ask questions, you can see how to generate that list of IP addresses, etc. So that part is true. Now, the second part, this tool is super private. Nobody has this tool anywhere. It is coded by the team itself, and you can download it only from us. Is of course false, because it's on VirusTotal. I would be really curious to know if the developers uploaded this sample to VirusTotal themselves to test for antivirus detection rates, right? To see if they would be flagged as malicious, or if this was just one of their customers that were uploading the tool for some reason. It's hard to say, but either way, it is certainly not super private now. Okay, so is Kurtler SCADA ICS malware? In the Dragos year in review, we have a section that is an ICS malware definition, and our lead malware analyst has spent a lot of time thinking about what ICS malware should be defined as and talking with relevant members of the community to get a definition that's very concrete and clear cut. So we have ICS malware that's defined as ICS capable software intentionally designed for adverse effects on operational technology environments. Okay, that's our ICS malware definition. And to be confirmed as ICS malware, it has to meet the following 3 properties. And if it fails any one of these, it's not considered ICS malware, but it has to be ICS capable, right? In some way, it has to speak some ICS protocol or do something with an ICS project file or something that's ICS specific. The second point is that it must be designed with malicious intent. And the third point is that it must have the ability for adverse effects on operational technology environments. So if we look at Kurtler SCADA with this lens in mind, then no, it's not ICS malware. It doesn't meet the first property because it has no built-in ICS-specific functionality. VNC is traditionally an IT protocol, like we mentioned before. It's not speaking Modbus or IEC 104 or any industrial protocol. It's just using common remote access protocols. So not really ICS capable. It's certainly designed for malicious intent, right? If the devil face ASCII art didn't make that clear, then hopefully the Telegram messages do. So that we can confirm, but it does not pass property number 3 either. So if you gain VNC access to an HMI, you could likely create adverse effects by randomly smashing buttons or doing something to manipulate the process. But the tool itself is not capable of doing that, right? Secondary action is required. So connectivity protocols are generally not considered adverse effects as it's just too broad. It's the operator of the remote access tool that actually does the damage, not the tool itself in this case. So if it could modify or interact with the HMI in an automated fashion, then maybe that's a different story. We'd have to revisit this definition or this case. But this just provides access. Control is a secondary step. Okay, so here's what the timeline looks like after the victims have been notified. We're going to talk about that victim notification process here in just a second. But overall, this was a pretty tight and quick timeline to discover, analyze, and notify victims of potential compromise. So like I mentioned in the previous timeline, we discovered the samples about 2 months after they were uploaded. About 2.5 weeks after that, Dragos' OT-CERT notified CISA of the compromises. 1 day after that, we published our internal worldview intelligence report on this activity. And then another version of the Kurtler SCADA tool, which had some more of those obfuscation techniques, was uploaded to VirusTotal on November 11th. So just 3 weeks after that. So let's now talk about the victim notification process. So how did we do it? Well, we leveraged our Dragos OT-CERT team, which is headed by the amazing Don Capelli. For those who are unfamiliar with OT-CERT, this is a community of members in the industrial space that's aimed at helping collaborate and uplift the security of organizations from small businesses to large businesses. OT-CERT has partners like information sharing communities, and in fact, it has over 2,400 members now. OT-CERT provides a variety of different resources and events for its members. It aims to help organizations, regardless of size or where they're at in their kind of quote unquote cybersecurity journey. They also offer free cybersecurity resources like best practice blogs, webinars, working sessions, vulnerability disclosures, and more. But of course, this case leveraged OT-CERT's victim notification process. So by analyzing the HMI screen captures that the administrator uploaded to Telegram, we can find some identifiable information. I've redacted them from the screenshots that were in this presentation, but we passed along this identifiable information to partners like CISA and Norma Cyber. Norma Cyber, for those who are unfamiliar, focuses on cyber threats specific to the maritime sector. And these external collaborations were so incredibly useful. Analysts at Norma were able to identify the exact ship and software that was used, that was running the compromised VNC server, which was just awesome. It was very difficult, at least from my perspective, to find that information, but their expertise went a long way. So a big thanks to them and a big thanks to CISA for their help. So one of the victims turned out to have a real positive outcome. So I just want to read what we heard back from them, which was, we were able to make contact and share the info. It rattled them a bit. they have also engaged CISA for their services as a result of the notification, which feels like an awesome win to me. Not only were they obviously not aware of the exposed asset, but then they subsequently engaged with CISA for some of their services, and hopefully that bolstered their cybersecurity posture, and they take it a little bit more seriously now. Or just, kind of clean up some of the gaps they had maybe missed. They could have taken it seriously before too, but that's near the best case scenario for us, but it's certainly not always that smooth. Some victims, frankly, just don't care. They might be compromised, but perhaps it's not a critical service, or it's a very small phishing ship. Whatever the reason is, they don't want to engage, and that's the reality of victim notifications sometimes. They don't owe us anything, not even a response at times. So while we'd prefer, obviously, that they clean up and secure their systems, at the end of the day, it's their call and their choice. The only thing we can do is notify them, and we did that. So this type of hacktivism is super common, and it should remind us that good cyber hygiene is important and effective. So this type of compromising of systems is very easy, but thankfully, so are the mitigations, right? Thriller SCADA, at the end of the day, is a glorified VNC client with some brute forcing capabilities that they're aiming at, opportunistically at exposed devices that were not set up with security in mind, right? This is not a technically impressive capability, I would argue. But I would also argue that it doesn't have to be to pose a risk, right? If you expose your devices on the internet, they're going to be sitting ducks. It doesn't matter how impressive of a capability is if it gets the job done. And in fact, especially if it's a low-hanging fruit technique that works, then I would expect that opportunistic attackers take advantage of that. Okay, so the screenshot that you're seeing here is from the website of a vendor who produces some of the software which was compromised in these cases. So I just wanted to read it. I'm not trying to shame them or anything, but just kind of express where we're at, kind of in the state of industrial cybersecurity for some of these smaller vendors. So I'll read it now. So one may be concerned about rogue actors connecting through VNC to spy on secret data or remotely operate the system. VNC can have several layers of security. The VNC client must give a password before connecting. Blacklists may exempt certain machines from connecting. Non-standard port numbers may be used, etc. We have currently chosen not to implement these means in order to avoid too much complexity. We think the fact that the blank will only activate VNC when he wants to, and that his address is neither static nor easily found, gives a reasonable degree of security. This policy may be changed if so demanded. So please so demand if this is the security level which some vendors are operating. I'm not saying that all vendors are like this, but often smaller, less resourced vendors they have significant constraints that can lead to some poor security choices. So I don't want to blame the vendors always or anything like that. It's a bigger problem than just poor vendor implementations. But designing secure systems from the start would go a long way in mitigating this type of opportunistic activity. So kind of in conclusion of this story now, defense, the good news is that defense is doable, right? The security controls needed to mitigate this type of activity is not super complicated. You don't need the latest and greatest, right? In the castle analogy here, you don't necessarily need a huge store of cannonballs or the most skilled knights or whatever. You just need to bring up the moat, right? Like you just need to lock the door. It's those simple security controls and mechanisms that need to be enabled to avoid some of this opportunistic type of hacktivism. The bad news is that hacktivists will continue to abuse poorly secured and exposed systems to gain attention and notoriety, and that's just where things are at, and probably I would assess that they will not change over the next few years. Another major takeaway from this story is that collaboration was absolutely key. We really could not have done it without OT-CERT, and OT-CERT just came into existence a few years ago, right? So that collaboration throughout the industry so that we can notify the victims, because I have a very limited subset of people that I know, but if we can keep N+1ing those, where we then can reach out to the victims. That's an awesome spot to be at for the industry. And in this specific story, proactive threat hunting actually yielded some success, right? Like we had a hypothesis for a threat hunt that maybe there's some geopolitical activist activity going on in VirusTotal that relates to OT operational technology that we can find, right? And then of course we identified the hacktivist activity, notifying the victims, and informed the community of it. So in closing here, just some simple mitigations. If you are an OT asset owner, here's some simple stuff you can do, some simple steps that you can take to kind of do those security basics to make sure you're avoiding that low-hanging fruit. So ensuring industrial devices are not directly exposed to the internet, right? Use a VPN if you need to remotely access the system. Please don't just port forward. Utilize allow and deny lists and restrict access to those remote services. Not everyone in your network should be able to go and access a VNC server and poke around on the screen, right? If you limit that traffic, that will go a long way. And then, of course, ensuring that default or weak credentials are changed on your VNC server and deactivating remote access solutions if not needed. All of these steps greatly reduces the attack surface. So yeah, I hope this presentation was insightful in some way. I thank you guys very much for your time. I'm Sam Hanson, and thank you to SANS ICS for hosting me, and thank you to Dragos as well. I believe we're now moving on to a Q&A. All right, I am just pulling up the questions here.
Hey, Sam, not seeing any questions at this moment.
Perfect. Okay, perfect. Well, feel free to ask now. We'll give it maybe a minute or so. And if not, feel free to email me or DM me on social media. Yeah, you can see my email there on the thank you slide. Okay, well, I will assume there are no questions at this moment.
Thanks, Sam. We wanted to take just a moment to invite everyone to join us at the 20th Annual ICS Security Summit this June 15th through the 23rd at Disney World, Florida. This summit offers something for everyone, for those new to ICS OT security to more advanced seasoned practitioners. The event will feature 2 days of SANS instructor-led workshops, talks, demos, and hands-on labs. There will also be plenty of time for fun during the night out at Epcot, as well as our evening receptions where we'll have surprise Disney characters. In-person attendees will also get exclusive access to discounted rates or tickets to Disney World and discount hotel rates at Contemporary Resort. So feel free to bring the family. For more information about the 20th Annual ICS Security Summit, please visit our events page on our website or check out the link here in the Zoom chat. And with that, wanted to say a special thank you to Sam for your presentation today and for helping to bring content like this to the community. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. You can find your CPEs for all completed webcasts by logging into your SANS portal account, navigating to your account dashboard, then clicking My Webcasts. You can then download your CPE on the right-hand side of the page. Until next time, take care, and we hope to see you again.